My name is Daniel Mercer, and I was 34 years old when I started waking up at 4:06 in the morning. The first time, I thought it was a coincidence. I opened my eyes in the darkness, still half asleep, and saw an elderly woman sitting at the end of my bed. She was wearing a long gray dress, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her white hair hanging over one shoulder. She didn't move. She didn't look at me. She simply sat there, staring toward the bedroom door. I couldn't breathe. I reached for the lamp beside my bed, but my hand stopped halfway. I was afraid that if I moved, she would look at me. So I closed my eyes. I counted to 10. When I opened them again, she was gone. I turned on the lamp. The room was empty. The bedroom door was closed. I checked the hallway, the bathroom, and the living room. Nothing. I told myself it had been a dream. The next morning, I went to work and forgot about it. At least, I tried to. The following night, I went to bed at 11. I slept normally until I suddenly woke up. 4:06, the same time. The woman was sitting at the end of my bed again. This time, I noticed her shoes. They were wet. I stared at them for several seconds. Then I looked at the floor. There were 3 wet footprints beside the bed. My bedroom carpet was completely dry everywhere else. I switched on the lamp. The woman disappeared. The footprints remained. I touched one with my finger. Cold water covered my fingertip. I didn't sleep again that night. The next evening, I moved the bedroom chair against the door and placed a glass of water on the floor beside my bed. I wanted something that could prove to me whether I was actually seeing someone. At 4:06, I woke up. The chair was no longer against the door. It was sitting at the end of my bed. The woman was sitting in it. I stared at her. She looked older than I remembered. Her skin was pale, almost gray. Her hands were still folded in her lap. I whispered, "Who are you?" She didn't answer. I turned on the lamp. The chair was empty. But the glass of water on the floor was gone. I searched the room. It was sitting on the dresser. I knew I hadn't moved it. I started taking photographs before going to sleep. The first night, nothing appeared. The second night, I found the chair in a different position. The third night, the bedroom door was open. On the fourth night, I woke up before 4:06. The room was silent. I checked the clock. 4:05, I sat up and waited. The second hand moved slowly. Then it reached 12. 4:06, the woman appeared at the end of my bed. This time, she was looking directly at me. I couldn't move. Her lips slowly parted. I expected her to speak. Instead, she raised one trembling hand and pointed toward my bedroom wall. I turned. There was an old photograph hanging there. It was a picture of me as a child. I had taken it from my parents' house years earlier. I looked back at the woman. She was gone. I got out of bed and walked toward the photograph. Something about it looked different. I pulled it from the wall. There were 4 people standing behind me in the picture. My parents. My younger sister. And an elderly woman. I had never seen her before. I turned the photograph over. There was a date written in faded ink. June 14, 1996. I stared at the woman in the photograph. She was wearing the same gray dress. The same white hair. The same expression. Then I noticed something that made my hands start shaking. She wasn't standing in the background. She was standing directly behind me. Her hand was resting on my shoulder. And I was only 8 years old. I didn't go to work the next morning. I stayed in my apartment with the photograph sitting on the kitchen table, staring at the woman behind me. I called my mother and asked her about the picture. There was a long silence. Then she said, "Where did you find that?" I told her it had been hanging in my bedroom. She didn't answer. I asked who the woman was. My mother finally said, "I don't know." "You've never seen her?" No, I knew she was lying. I could hear it in her voice. I asked about the date on the back. June 14, 1996. My mother told me that was the day of my 8th birthday. I asked if she remembered taking the photograph. She said yes. Then she changed the subject. I called my father. He didn't answer. I tried again. Nothing. That evening, I drove to my parents' old house, the place where I had grown up. My father had moved away years earlier, but my mother still kept boxes of old photographs in the attic. I searched through them for hours. I found pictures from my childhood, school photographs, birthdays, Christmas mornings, vacations, family gatherings. The woman was there. Not in every picture. Only certain ones. Sometimes she stood behind me. Sometimes she was sitting in the background. Once, she was visible through a window. Another time, she was standing beside the family car. The strangest part was that the photographs were taken in different years. 1992, 1994. 1996, 1998. 2001, the woman never changed. She always wore the same gray dress. The same white hair. The same expression. I called my mother again. She finally admitted she had seen the woman before. Where? In the house. When? Before you were born. I felt a cold pressure in my chest. What does that mean? My mother began crying. She told me that when she was pregnant with me, she sometimes woke up at exactly 4:06 in the morning. She would see an old woman sitting in the hallway. She thought it was her mother. But her mother had died years earlier. After I was born, the woman stopped appearing. Until my 8th birthday. I asked my mother why she never told me. Because your father made me promise. Promise what? That we would never talk about her. I drove home after midnight. I didn't want to sleep, but eventually exhaustion took over. At 3:58, I woke up. The room was freezing. I looked toward the end of the bed. The woman wasn't there. I checked the clock. 4:02, I waited. 4:03, 4:04. 4:05, then I heard a soft sound behind me. Someone was breathing. I turned slowly. The woman was standing beside my bed. She wasn't sitting this time. She was looking down at me. Her face was wet, as if she had been crying. I whispered, "Why are you here?" She raised her hand. She pointed toward the hallway. Then she disappeared. I stayed awake until sunrise. At 7:30, I noticed something on the floor. A trail of wet footprints led from my bedroom to the front door. I followed them. The front door was locked. But the footprints continued through it. I opened the door. There were no footprints outside. I went back inside and found something on the hallway floor. An old silver key. I recognized it immediately. It belonged to my childhood bedroom. I hadn't seen it in more than 20 years. I drove back to my parents' house. My mother was waiting for me. She looked at the key and started crying. "You found it. What does it open?" She didn't answer. I took her upstairs. She led me to my old bedroom. The room hadn't changed much. The same wallpaper. The same wooden closet. The same small window. She walked to the closet and moved a box aside. Behind it was a tiny wooden door built into the wall. I had never noticed it as a child. I inserted the key. The lock opened. Inside was a narrow space filled with old photographs. Hundreds of them. I picked up the first one. It showed me sleeping in my childhood bed. The date was written underneath. March 3, 1992. I picked up another. Me sleeping again. 1994, another. 1996, then another. 2001, the photographs continued all the way to the present. The last one was dated that night. I looked at it. It showed me sleeping in my apartment. The woman was sitting at the end of my bed. But there was something else in the photograph. A second figure was standing behind her. I couldn't see its face. Then I heard my mother whisper from the doorway. "Daniel, don't turn around." I stayed completely still. I could hear my mother's breathing behind me, but I didn't turn around. The photograph was still in my hand, and the second figure stood behind the old woman, its face hidden in darkness. "Mom," I whispered, "what is behind me?" She didn't answer. "Mom." Her voice finally came. "Nothing you need to see." I slowly turned. The doorway was empty. My mother was gone. I ran downstairs and found her standing in the kitchen, staring at the back window. I asked why she had left me alone upstairs. She looked confused. I never came upstairs. I showed her the photograph. Her face went pale. She took it from my hand and stared at the figure. "That wasn't there before." "What is it?" "I don't know." "You do know." She sat down at the kitchen table. After several seconds, she told me something my parents had kept from me for almost 30 years. When I was 8 years old, I disappeared from my bedroom for almost 6 hours. My parents searched the house, called the police, and even searched the surrounding woods. Then, just before sunrise, they found me sitting on my bed. I had no memory of leaving the room. But there was one thing I kept repeating. I was waiting for her. Who? The woman. My mother covered her face with both hands. "She told me you were sleeping somewhere else," I said. My mother looked at me. "You weren't talking about the old woman." I felt my stomach tighten. What was I talking about? She whispered, "You said there was a man standing beside your bed." I thought about the second figure in the photograph. Then I remembered something from the previous night. The woman hadn't been pointing toward the hallway. She had been pointing toward something behind me. I drove home before sunset. I didn't turn on the lights. I sat in the bedroom and waited. At 3:40, I placed every childhood photograph on the floor. At 3:55, I started recording. At 4:05, nothing happened. Then the clock changed. 4:06, the room became freezing. The woman appeared at the end of my bed. This time, she wasn't looking at me. She was staring at the bedroom door. Then the door slowly opened. A dark figure stood in the hallway. I couldn't see its face. The woman stood up. For the first time, she looked frightened. She stepped between me and the doorway. The figure moved closer. I heard a man's voice. Daniel. The voice sounded exactly like my father's. I almost answered. The woman suddenly turned toward me and shook her head. Then she pointed at the photographs on the floor. I looked down. Every photograph had changed. In each one, the dark figure was standing closer to me. In the oldest photograph, it was outside the house. In the next, it was behind a window. Then inside the hallway. Then beside my childhood bed. And in the final photograph, it was standing directly behind me. I looked at the woman. She whispered her first words. "It's been waiting for you." The figure stepped into the room. I ran. I grabbed the bedroom door and slammed it shut. Something hit the other side. I ran downstairs and locked myself inside the bathroom. The pounding continued for several seconds. Then everything went silent. I waited. Nothing. When I finally opened the door, the apartment was empty. The woman was gone. The photographs were gone. Only one picture remained on the floor. I picked it up. It showed my bedroom. The woman was sitting at the end of my bed. I was asleep. And behind her stood my father. He was holding a small photograph in his hand. I turned the picture over. There was writing on the back. June 14, 1996. Then I noticed something else. The photograph hadn't been taken from the doorway. It had been taken from inside the room. From the exact spot where I was standing. I called my father. This time, he answered. Neither of us spoke. Then he said, "She finally found you." I asked him who the woman was. He said, "Your grandmother." My grandmother died before I was born. I know. Then who is she? He went silent. I heard him breathing. Then he whispered, "She's the reason you survived." I felt cold. Survived what? He said, "The night you disappeared." The call ended. At 4:06 the following morning, I woke up again. The woman was sitting at the end of my bed. But this time, she wasn't alone. My father was standing behind her. Both of them were staring at me. My father raised one hand and pointed toward the bedroom wall. I turned. There was a new photograph hanging there. It showed me sleeping. The date underneath it was tomorrow. And beside my bed, the woman was sitting exactly where she was now. But there was no dark figure. I looked back at them. My father was crying. The woman slowly smiled. Then she whispered, "Tomorrow, you finally remember." I didn't sleep after that. I sat against the bedroom wall until sunrise, staring at the photograph dated tomorrow. My father was standing behind the woman, crying. I couldn't understand why he had been afraid of her, or why she had spent years appearing beside my bed. At 7 o'clock that morning, I called him. He answered immediately. "Come to the old house." "Why?" "Because you need to remember." I drove there before noon. My father was waiting in the living room. He looked older than the night before and placed a small cardboard box on the table. I should have told you everything years ago. Inside were photographs, hospital records, and a newspaper clipping dated June 15, 1996. The headline made my hands go cold, 8-year-old boy found alive after missing overnight. I looked at my father. "You said I disappeared for 6 hours." I lied. "How long?" He looked down. 3 days. I couldn't speak. You were missing for 3 days, Daniel. The police searched the woods, the river, every house in the area. Where was I? My father pushed an old photograph toward me. It showed our house at night, with a bedroom window on the second floor. Standing outside it was the old woman. She found you, he said. Where? In the basement. I stared at him. There was a room beneath the house that we didn't know existed. He pulled another photograph from the box. It showed a narrow room filled with old furniture. At the center was a small wooden bed. You were sleeping there when we found you. My father continued. Your grandmother had been dead for 6 years, but you kept saying she had been taking care of you. She wasn't your grandmother. What? My father explained that the previous owners had lost their daughter in 1961. The girl had disappeared from her bedroom during the night and was never found. Years later, people began reporting an old woman appearing in the house. Nobody knew who she was. But every family that lived there eventually left. My father had never believed the stories until I disappeared. What happened in the basement? I found you sleeping beside her. Was she alive? No. She was sitting beside you, but there was no body. I remembered the woman at the end of my bed. Her gray dress. Her wet shoes. Her hands folded quietly in her lap. She protected me. My father nodded. From what? The man. My father looked at me. You saw him too. Who was he? My father opened the final photograph. It showed the basement room. The woman was sitting beside the little bed. Behind her stood the dark figure. This time, I could see its face. It was my father. But the photograph had been taken in 1996. My father hadn't been in the basement when I disappeared. He had been outside with the police. I looked at him. You weren't there. No, then who was that? My father began to cry. I don't know. That night, I went back to my apartment. I needed to know what would happen at 4:06. I placed a camera on the dresser and left the bedroom door open. At 4:05, the apartment was silent. At 4:06, the woman appeared. She sat at the end of my bed. I stared at her. She looked at me for several seconds, then pointed toward the camera. I checked the recording. The screen showed me sleeping. The woman wasn't there. Instead, someone was standing beside my bed. The dark figure. I looked up. It was standing behind me. I could hear its breathing. The woman suddenly stood. She moved between us. The figure reached toward me. The woman screamed. It was the first sound I had ever heard from her. Every light in the apartment exploded at once. The bedroom filled with darkness. I heard something fall. Then silence. When the lights came back, the figure was gone. The woman was standing beside my bed. She looked at me one final time. Then she smiled. I whispered, "Who are you?" She walked toward the bedroom door. Before disappearing, she turned and said, "Your grandmother." Then she was gone. I never saw her again. I moved out of the apartment 2 weeks later. My father died the following winter. Before his funeral, I found one final photograph inside his belongings. It showed me as an 8-year-old boy, asleep in the basement room. My grandmother was sitting beside me. The dark figure stood behind her. But this time, I noticed something I had never seen before. The figure wasn't looking at me. It was looking at the woman. And the woman was holding its hand away from my head. I turned the photograph over. There was a sentence written on the back in my father's handwriting. She wasn't coming to haunt you, Daniel. She was keeping it away from you. I kept that photograph for the rest of my life. But there is one thing I still cannot explain. Every few years, I wake up at exactly 4:06 in the morning. There is never anyone sitting at the end of my bed. There is only a cold spot beside me. And sometimes, when I open my eyes, I can hear an old woman's voice whispering from the darkness. Don't look behind you. The first time someone knocked on my door at 3:17 in the morning, I thought it was one of my neighbors. I had just finished a 14-hour shift at the hospital, and I was too exhausted to care who was outside. 3 slow knocks. I sat up in bed and checked the clock. 3:17 a.m. I waited. Nothing. Then came 3 more knocks. I walked to the door and looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty. I opened the door. There was a white envelope lying on the floor. No name. No stamp. No writing on the outside. I picked it up and looked down the hallway again. Nobody was there. I brought the envelope inside and locked the door. For a few seconds, I just stared at it. Then I opened it. There was one sheet of paper inside. Only one sentence. Dr. Morgan, don't go to room 17 tomorrow. I read it twice. Then I laughed. It was probably some stupid prank from someone at the hospital. I threw the paper into the trash and went to bed. The next morning, I woke up at 6:30. I had almost forgotten about the letter. Almost. When I arrived at the hospital, everything seemed normal. I changed into my scrubs, checked my schedule, and started my rounds. At 10:15, my supervisor stopped me in the hallway. Claire, I need you in room 17. I froze. For a moment, I couldn't answer. He looked at me. You okay? Why? New admission. Elderly male. He's refusing everyone except a doctor. I looked down the hallway. Room 17 was at the far end. I remembered the letter. Can someone else take it? He frowned. Why? I just don't feel right about it. He smiled. You've been working too many hours. Then he walked away. I stood there for several seconds before following him. Room 17 was colder than the rest of the ward. The door was already open. An old man was sitting on the bed. He looked extremely thin, with pale skin and gray hair. His hands were folded over the blanket. He didn't look at me when I entered. I checked his chart. His name was Thomas Bell. 78 years old. No family listed. No emergency contact. I walked closer. Mr. Bell. He slowly turned his head. His eyes met mine. Then he smiled. You opened the first letter. I stopped breathing. What did you say? His smile disappeared. He looked toward the door. Then back at me. The first letter. I felt something cold move through my stomach. Do I know you? No. Then how do you know about the letter? He didn't answer. I checked his pulse. Normal. Blood pressure slightly elevated. Nothing unusual. But while I was examining him, he kept staring at me. Finally, I asked, who sent it? He whispered, she's trying to warn you. Who? He looked toward the empty corner of the room. The woman. I turned. There was nothing there. When I looked back at him, he was crying. Please don't let her see you at night. I stepped away from the bed. Mr. Bell, what woman are you talking about? He didn't answer. He just kept staring at the corner. I followed his eyes. Still nothing. Then I heard a faint sound behind me. 3 knocks. I turned toward the door. Nobody was there. When I looked back at the bed, Mr. Bell was sitting completely still. His eyes were closed. He was dead. The room filled with nurses within seconds. They checked him. Called the attending physician. Started paperwork. Everyone assumed it was natural. He was 78. His heart had simply stopped. But I couldn't stop thinking about what he'd said. You opened the first letter. That evening, I went home earlier than usual. I checked the hallway before entering my apartment. Nothing. I locked the door. Checked every room. Nothing. At 3:10, I was still awake. I kept telling myself it was coincidence. At 3:17, the knocking came. 3 slow knocks. I didn't move. 3 more. I walked toward the door. Then I stopped. Because this time, I heard something on the other side. A woman's voice. Very quiet. Almost a whisper. Dr. Morgan. I stepped backward. The voice came again. Please open the door. I didn't answer. The hallway went silent. I waited for several minutes. Then I heard footsteps moving away. I finally looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty. But there was another white envelope on the floor. I opened the door just enough to grab it. Then I locked myself inside. My hands were shaking as I opened the envelope. There was another sentence. Tomorrow, a woman will ask you if you remember her. I read it once. Then again. And underneath that sentence, written in smaller letters, was something that made my blood run cold. She already remembers you. I barely slept that night. The second letter was still sitting on my kitchen table when I left for the hospital, and I kept thinking about the final sentence. She already remembers you. I couldn't understand what it meant. I had never seen the woman from the letter. At least, I didn't think I had. Around 11 that morning, I was walking past the older wing when I noticed a woman standing at the end of the hallway. She looked to be in her 70s. Gray hair. Long dark coat. Very pale face. She wasn't moving. I stopped. She looked directly at me. Then she smiled. I walked toward her. Can I help you? She didn't answer. Instead, she asked a question. Do you remember me? My stomach dropped. I couldn't speak for a moment. No. Her expression changed. Almost like she was disappointed. Your mother did. I felt the air leave my lungs. What did you say? She turned and started walking away. I followed her. Wait. She kept walking. I turned the corner. She was gone. I checked both ends of the hallway. Nothing. A nurse passing by looked at me strangely. Are you looking for someone? There was an elderly woman here. What woman? I don't know. She shook her head. There haven't been any visitors on this floor today. I returned to my office and pulled up the hospital records. I searched every variation of my mother's name. My mother had worked at the hospital for almost 20 years. She had died 6 years earlier. I knew most of her history. But one record caught my attention. A patient file from 1984. The patient's name was Margaret Hale. I opened it. The photograph stopped me cold. It was the same woman. Same face. Same gray hair. Same expression. The date of admission was March 8, 1984. I checked the next page. Her age was listed as 72. I stared at the number. If the photograph was real, she would have been more than 100 years old now. I searched for a death certificate. Nothing. No discharge record. No transfer. No explanation. Just one final note. Patient removed from room 17 at 3:17 a.m. I read it several times. Then I noticed my mother's signature at the bottom. My hands began to shake. She had signed the file. That afternoon, I called my mother's old friend, Helen. She had worked with my mother for years. I asked about Margaret Hale. There was a long silence. Then Helen said, "You shouldn't be looking for her." "Why?" "Because your mother spent years trying to make sure you never did." "What happened in room 17? Helen lowered her voice. "Your mother said Margaret wasn't alone." "Who was with her?" "I don't know." "You do know." Another silence. Then Helen whispered, something that wasn't supposed to be there. The call ended. That night, I went home early. I didn't want to be alone, but I had nowhere else to go. At 3:17, the knocking started again. 3 slow knocks. I stayed in bed. Then I heard the same woman's voice. "Dr. Morgan." I closed my eyes. "Please open the door." I didn't move. The voice became softer. "Your mother opened it." My eyes opened. I got out of bed. I walked toward the door. Then I noticed something underneath it. A shadow. Someone was standing directly outside. I stopped breathing. The shadow didn't move. I looked through the peephole. Nobody was there. But the shadow remained. I stepped backward. Then it disappeared. A white envelope slid underneath the door. I waited several seconds before picking it up. Inside was another message. "Don't call your mother tomorrow." I stared at it. My mother had been dead for 6 years. I couldn't call her. I almost laughed from exhaustion. Then my phone rang. I looked at the screen. My mother's name was displayed. I couldn't move. The phone kept ringing. I watched it until the call ended. A few seconds later, it rang again. Same name. Same number. I answered. For several seconds, there was only static. Then I heard breathing. Slow. Old. Familiar. Claire. My mother's voice. I dropped the phone. The call ended. I stood there shaking. A new notification appeared on my screen. A voicemail. I pressed play. My mother's voice whispered, "Don't come back to room 17. Then another voice appeared behind hers. A woman's voice. "She's already coming." The recording ended. I didn't sleep that night. At sunrise, I drove straight to the hospital. I went to the records department and asked for the original room 17 files. The clerk looked uncomfortable. "There aren't any." "There are." "No, Dr. Morgan." She lowered her voice. Room 17 was sealed in 1984. "Why?" She looked toward the hallway. "Because 3 people disappeared." I stared at her. "Who?" She handed me a folder. The first name was Margaret Hale. The second was a nurse. The third name made my hands go numb. Claire Morgan. My name. I looked at the date. 1984. I was born in 1991. The clerk whispered. Your mother never told you. I couldn't answer. Then, from somewhere down the hallway, I heard 3 slow knocks. I stood there staring at my name on the old hospital record, unable to understand how it could be there 7 years before I was born, while the clerk looked at me with the uneasy expression of someone who had shown me something forbidden. Where did you get this? She pointed toward a cabinet and whispered, it was there when I started working here. I opened the folder, hoping I had misread the date, but the paper showed June 1984, and underneath my name was my mother's signature. I felt sick. My mother wrote this? The clerk nodded slowly. She was the one who asked them to seal room 17. Why? She never told anyone. I took the folder and walked away before she could stop me, carrying it down the hallway while every part of me told me to leave the hospital, get in my car, and never come back. Instead, I went to the basement archives. I found the original records for 1984 inside a dusty box, where I discovered dozens of reports describing strange incidents around room 17, patients hearing someone whispering their names from empty rooms, nurses seeing an elderly woman standing at the end of the hallway, and 3 people disappearing and were never found. Then I found my mother's report. It was 2 pages, but the final paragraph made my hands tremble. I have seen the child again. I read it twice. There was no explanation for who the child was. Only a date. June 14, 1984. The same night Margaret Hale disappeared. I searched until I found a photograph folded inside the back of the file. It showed room 17 before it had been sealed. My mother was standing outside the door, and beside her was Margaret Hale. But there was someone else in the photograph. A little girl. She stood inside, looking directly at the camera. I recognized her immediately. It was me. I dropped the photograph. There was no way. I was not alive in 1984. I picked it up again, hoping my eyes were playing tricks, but the little girl's face was unmistakable. The same eyes. The same scar near my eyebrow. The same face from childhood photographs. I turned the photograph over. My mother's handwriting covered the back. She keeps appearing younger. I felt a cold pressure spread across my chest. Then I heard something behind me. 3 slow knocks. I turned toward the archive door. Nobody was there. Another 3 slow knocks followed. This time, they came from the basement wall. I stepped closer and noticed a metal door behind several shelves. There was no number on it, but the hospital blueprint showed something that tightened my stomach. Room 17 was supposed to be on the other side. I pulled the shelves away, finding a narrow passage. The door opened easily. Beyond it was a corridor older than the rest of the hospital, with peeling paint, exposed pipes, and dead light stretching into the darkness. At the end was room 17. The door was covered with layers of paint and an old warning sign. I reached for the handle. Before I could touch it, I heard my mother's voice behind me. Claire. I turned so quickly that I almost fell. Nobody was there. Then her voice came again, softer this time. You were never supposed to find this room. I opened the door. The room was empty except for a wooden chair in the center. On the chair was a white envelope. My name was written on it. I opened it with shaking hands. Inside was a single sentence. Tonight, when the knocking stops, open the door. I read it twice. Then I heard movement behind the chair. A woman stepped from the darkness. Margaret Hale. She looked exactly as she had in 1984, unchanged. She didn't approach me. She stared at me with tears running down her face. Why do you keep sending me these letters? I asked. She shook her head. I didn't. Then who did? She looked toward the door. You already know. I felt my heart pounding. My mother? Margaret slowly shook her head. No. She pointed toward the chair. I looked down. There was another photograph lying on the seat. It showed my mother standing beside Margaret in room 17. But this time, I could see the little girl clearly. She was holding my mother's hand. I turned the photograph over. There was another sentence written on the back. Your mother wasn't protecting you from us. I stared at the words. Margaret whispered, she was protecting us from you. The lights went out. I heard the door slam behind me. Then 3 knocks came from inside the wall. I didn't move. The knocking became louder. 3 more. Then I heard a child laughing somewhere behind me. I turned. The room was empty. But the wooden chair was no longer in the center. It was directly behind me. On the seat was a fresh white envelope. I opened it. This time, the handwriting was mine. Claire, if you're reading this, you have already remembered. Then, from the hallway outside room 17, I heard my mother's voice. Claire, come home. I backed away from the door. Her voice came again. It's time. And then the knocking started from inside the room with me. I stayed inside room 17 for several seconds, unable to decide whether the voice outside the door was really my mother's or something that had learned how she sounded, while the 3 knocks continued from somewhere inside the walls and the woman who had been standing beside the chair was no longer there. Mom. My voice sounded weak in the empty room. There was no answer. I looked at the envelope still lying on the chair, the one written in my own handwriting, and for the first time I noticed something strange about the paper, because underneath my name was a date that had not happened yet. Tomorrow. I opened it again. There was only one sentence. You need to remember what happened before you were born. I sat down on the floor and tried to breathe, but memories began appearing in fragments that didn't belong to me, a hospital corridor filled with yellow light, my mother's hands shaking as she carried a small child, Margaret crying beside room 17, and a little girl standing silently at the end of the hallway while everyone around her acted as if she wasn't there. Then I remembered something else. My mother had once told me that I was born 7 years after she started working at the hospital, but she had never explained why she kept an old photograph of room 17 hidden inside her bedroom drawer. I had seen that photograph when I was a child. I just hadn't understood what I was looking at. The little girl in the picture was me. I stood up and walked toward the door. Mom, what did you do? The hallway remained silent. Then I heard her answer from somewhere behind me. I didn't do anything to you, Claire. I turned. She was standing inside the room. My mother. Not the way I remembered her during her final years, but younger, exactly as she looked in the photographs from the hospital. I couldn't speak. She looked at me with tears in her eyes. You were born in 1991, she said, but that wasn't the first time you existed. I felt my knees weaken. What does that mean? You came into room 17 before you came into this world. She told me that in 1984, Margaret Hale had been admitted after claiming that something followed her from house to house, something that could imitate the voices of people she loved and appear in photographs before anyone actually arrived. My mother had believed Margaret was mentally ill until the night she disappeared. After that, strange things began happening around room 17. Patients heard voices. Nurses saw a child standing in empty hallways. Photographs developed with people who hadn't been present when they were taken. Then my mother saw the child. She recognized her immediately. The child had the same face I would have years later. She wasn't a ghost, my mother whispered. She was a warning. I stared at her. Warning about what? My mother looked toward the corner of the room. About what was following you. The temperature dropped. I heard breathing behind me. My mother grabbed my hand. Don't turn around. I froze. Something moved across the floor behind us. Slowly. Quietly. My mother tightened her grip. It has been trying to reach you since 1984. Why? Because you were the only person it couldn't imitate. I looked at her. Then why did Margaret keep appearing? Because she was protecting you. And the letters? My mother began crying. She wrote the first ones. I stared at her. But she said she didn't. She can't remember writing them anymore. The lights flickered. My mother looked toward the door. We don't have much time. 3 knocks sounded from the hallway. My mother stepped closer to me. Whatever happens, don't open the door when you hear my voice. Then she disappeared. I was alone again. The room became completely silent. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then, at exactly 3:17 a.m., 3 knocks came from the other side of the door. I didn't move. Claire. My mother's voice. I closed my eyes. Please open the door. I covered my ears. The voice became louder. Claire, it's me. Then another voice spoke from behind me. My own voice. Mom, don't open it. I opened my eyes. Margaret was sitting in the wooden chair. She looked exhausted, almost transparent, and she was holding one final envelope. She placed it on the floor and pointed toward it. I picked it up. There was no name on the front. Inside was a single photograph. It showed room 17 in 1984. My mother was standing beside Margaret. The little girl was between them. And behind the little girl stood a dark figure. I turned the photograph over. My mother's handwriting was on the back. She wasn't coming to haunt you, Claire. She was keeping it away from you. I looked at Margaret. She pointed toward the dark figure. Then she whispered something I could barely hear. Look at its face. I turned the photograph around. The figure had no face. But as I stared at it, the image began changing. The figure moved closer to the camera. Then closer. Then I saw its face. It was mine. I dropped the photograph. The door behind me opened by itself. My mother's voice came from the hallway. Claire, come home. I stood completely still. The voice sounded exactly like her. Then the figure appeared in the doorway. It looked like me. Same face. Same clothes. Same expression. It smiled. And behind it stood Margaret. I suddenly understood why every letter had been trying to stop me from opening doors, answering voices, and looking behind myself. They weren't trying to keep something outside. They were trying to keep something from learning how to become me. The figure took one step forward. I stepped backward. It smiled again. Then it whispered. Thank you for remembering. The lights went out. I heard 3 knocks. Then silence. When the lights returned, room 17 was empty. There was no Margaret. No figure. No photograph. Only one white envelope lying on the chair. I opened it. The handwriting was mine. The message was short. Tomorrow, another doctor will receive the first letter. I left the hospital before sunrise and never returned. The police later told me room 17 had been sealed for decades and that there was no passage beneath the hospital, no hidden room, and no record of Margaret Hale ever being admitted. They said I had been under extreme stress. They said grief could make people see things that weren't there. I wanted to believe them. For 6 months, I almost did. Then, one morning, I found a white envelope outside my new apartment. There was no name on it. I already knew what was inside. I opened it. One sentence. Dr. Morgan, don't go to room 17 tomorrow. And underneath it was a second line that made my hands go cold. This time, I'm not warning you about the room. I'm warning you about the doctor.